And gentlemen, we are very pleased that you can join us this afternoon for this discussion of the recent Trump administration executive order regarding refugees. I know this has been very much in the news, and many of you are no doubt very familiar with this, but some, I suspect, have come to learn a bit more. So let me begin by just giving you a recap of the situation as it stands right now. On January 27th, President Trump signed an executive order banning entry or return to the United States by citizens of 7 largely Muslim countries for 90 days. It also barred entry of all refugees seeking escape from conflict or devastation for 120 days. It barred all Syrian refugees indefinitely, and it reduced the number of refugees entering the U.S. in FY 2017 from the Obama administration's target goal of 110,000 to 50,000. The rollout of executive order was problematic as the normal interagency process was bypassed. Departments such as State, DHS, Justice, and Defense, who would have a stake in the outcome of the document, were not consulted. Customs and Border Protection and U.S. Citizens and Immigration Services, the agencies tasked with carrying out the policy, were only giving a briefing call while Donald Trump was actually signing the executive order. Protests erupted across the country and in airports. The ACLU filed suit petitioning a federal court for a class action stay of deportation of immigrants and refugees trapped in airports. Temporary stays were imposed by different judges in Boston and New York. The acting Deputy Attorney General ordered justice employees not to comply with the order, and she was fired. Last Friday, the U.S. District Court Judge James Robart in the Western District of Washington, in response to lawsuits filed by the state's attorney generals of Washington and Minnesota, suspended the ban. The U.S. Justice Department filed an appeal just after midnight Saturday night, asking to pause Judge Robart's decision. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals court early Sunday morning denied the Justice Department its request. Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals then went on to ask both sides to prepare briefs so it could make a final decision. Thus, the ruling of the U.S. District Court Judge James Robart, who suspended the ban, will remain in place for now. It's 6 o'clock this evening. Just as we end this meeting, we will hear the briefs will be being presented to the Court of Appeals. There are many aspects of this executive order that are worth discussion and examination. The legality, the efficacy, the impact on security, and so forth. But today, here at SAIS, we are focused on what it means for refugees around the world, and what it means for those who not only value the U.S. government's traditional role in refugee resettlement, but who understand our responsibilities as signatories of the 1951 Convention and its subsequent protocols. Refugees themselves are fleeing war, persecution, oppression, and terrorism. The individuals and families on the list for resettlement are the most vulnerable. They are female-headed households, people needing immediate medical care, survivors of torture, and children at risk. The new homes provided by resettlement countries are life-saving for people who have no other option. For decades, the United States has been a global leader in the refugee protection, a tradition rooted in tolerance and open-mindedness of the American people. The executive order marks a break with a U.S. strong leadership role in the long history of protecting those who are fleeing conflict and persecution. This executive order takes our country down the ominous path of erecting barriers not on the basis of demonstrated security threat, but including religious affiliation as a factor. The order stands in contradiction to our country's long-cherished values. Today, we are very fortunate to have with 3 individuals who have a unique understanding of these issues. You have their bios with you, but let me begin by welcoming to the stage Michel Gabaudan, who has a long career with UNHCR and now is the president of Refugees International, the well-known refugee advocacy organization based here in Washington. He is well positioned to explain the global consequences of the executive order. Ann Richard, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Population in the Obama administration. The Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugees, and Migration. She was one of the architects in the Obama administration of its expansion of refugee intake numbers in the President's Summit at the UN last September. Ruth Wedgwood, a professor of international law and here at SAIS, can address many of the legal aspects of the executive order. And we look forward to all of them joining me on the stage.
Probably be here. Sure, on there. Sorry. Going in order. I have the privilege. Thank you.
Okay, so I thought we would start with Michel, who can give us the broad picture from the vantage point of a person who has spent years in the refugee community, working for UNHCR and in advocacy for with Refugees International.
Thank you very much, Maureen, and a pleasure to be here with Ruth and Anne. So the executive order was signed on 27 January, which was Holocaust Remembrance Day, a day that sadly reminds us that in these days, Jews from Germany had been barred from entry into the US on the suspicion that they may be Nazi infiltrators. So there was already then a tendency to conflate the victims with the perpetrators of abuse. And we think it is quite shocking that refugees are targeted in an executive order which unique purpose is to address the question of terrorism, again conflating the victim with the perpetrator. And in justifying that, the administration has very often correlated what has happened in Europe last year with the refugee resettlement program. And this is really comparing two processes that are completely different. In Europe, what you had is a mass arrival of about 1 million people in a year that could not be interviewed when they arrived, and they just led through the country, and all the European countries had to do vetting in a post facto way. Now, the large majority of these people were genuine refugees, there is no doubt about that, but in such a movement, it was easy for people which were less desirable to, of course, be part of that movement. That took place very quickly. This is completely different than what happens with the resettlement system, which Anne will address in more details, but which is subject to very intense vetting that take years and where really the government knows exactly who it is bringing on. On that resettlement program, I would like to say one thing that is, for us, essential is that the US has prioritized over the decades of this program the most vulnerable. These are the refugees who find life in the first asylum country to which they fled impossible, and the resettlement program really provides assistance to these people and relieves a little bit the pressure on the host country. Now, what the Act does, first by reducing the number that had been, the quota that had been voted last year of 110,000 people, reduces it to 50,000. That means there are 60,000 refugees who are in an advanced process of the vetting system, either at the stage of the UN or with the government, all of a sudden in the lurch. Can you imagine for people who have been refugee in camps or in fairly basic circumstances and who had that hope that finally it was going to arrive, and all of a sudden, by a stroke of a pen, their hopes have been completely dashed. The resettlement program is held for 4 months, which means probably a lot of people who have been in the vetting system would have to go back into some process of the vetting. So it really puts the whole program backwards for months, if not years, for a large number of people. That is if the ban is overturned. And finally, when it impedes Syrians to come, let's not forget that Syrians represent today almost 25% of the refugees worldwide. And they are concentrated in Lebanon. 1 in 4 inhabitants of Lebanon today is a refugee. In Syria, about 15% of the population, and in southern Turkey. So they put tremendous pressure on these countries who have been generous at the beginning of the outflow, but now have closed their borders and are becoming more difficult because they feel they are left alone. And when the government started increasing the number of Syrians, that was showing a sense of sharing the responsibility towards these refugees, and that is dashed for the time being. So these are the immediate impacts, and it means that women-headed household, that women, particularly at risk, people who need medical attention, people who have been tortured, the most vulnerable, will not have a solution for the foreseeable future. But in our view, there is a much more dramatic effect to that executive order, is that what is likely to be the impact on the longer term. Now, if you put a map of the world where refugees are, they are not in the US, they're not in Europe, they're not in Australia, they're not in Japan, they are not in the West, they are all in Africa and in the Middle East. This is where the big concentrations are. So when we lament our responsibility in taking refugee, we're not really looking at what is the burden that these refugees are putting on countries that have far less possibilities than we have and have been far more generous to date. The International Refugee Protection System was established some 60 years ago under very dynamic leadership by the US and supported by Australia and by Europe. What we've seen in the past decade is Australia backing up tremendously with from some of these obligations by shipping people who try to get to Australia to some Pacific islands so that they cannot claim protection by the laws of Australia. Europe was behaving reasonably well until last year when the closure of the border and the refusal to process people who arrive has really shown that they turned their back on the very international agreements they have signed, and the US remaining the last beacon of hope to say we still will try to drive the international system. And today, of course, what the president has done is showing his intention to turn its back to what has been really a very successful program supported in a bipartisan way for decades. So what we fear is that the indications that are being given now, and if you add to that all the discussion on possible reduced funding to the UN or defunding of the UN, indicates that the US does not want to carry on this leadership role. And if the US doesn't do it, why should other countries that have less facilities, less tradition, and less vocation continue to shoulder the responsibility when the US drops it? So we are very worried that if this ban continues, we don't know what happens after 4 months, whether some additional countries will be added or whether the countries that have been put on the list will be subtracted, but we have certainly reason to fear much more dramatic development. We fear the whole system will crumble. And this at a time where you have the highest number of refugees in the world since 30 or 40 years, when last year there was, for the first time since the UN exists, 2 days focused on refugees during the General Assembly where heads of state participated. Now, they did not achieve tremendous results. This is the UN. We know the process goes slowly, but there was a commitment by all governments to work on a compact on refugees to be issued by 2018. Now, without US leadership, I can tell you this will go absolutely nowhere. So I think we have reason to worry on the impact of what the executive order of last week will have. And I will make one last comment. There is a suggestion in the executive order that the US in the future would only accept people in the country if their intent to come to the US has been checked with the country of origin to see whether there are some reasons why the country should object to that. Now, that may be valuable for immigrants. It's utterly unacceptable for refugees. You cannot ask a refugee who claims persecution by a country that you are going to check with that country whether it is legitimate for this person to come to the US or no. And we don't know, the executive order is not that clear on whether this would apply to refugees also, but it does not eliminate them from that provision. And we're very worried about that last provision. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne.
Thank you all for turning out today. And I actually spy in the audience a few refugees from the State Department, but I will not point them out to you so that their anonymity will protect them in this current bizarre climate that is so different. As Michel said, we had bipartisan support for bringing refugees to the United States for years and years and years. Prominent Republicans were fierce anti-communists and wanted to help people fleeing the Soviet bloc and give them a new start in the United States. And that sentiment, coupled with Democrats pushing to help refugees and immigrants, made us a very, very powerful leader, the other countries being Canada and Australia. in trying to find more ways to help bring people to start their lives. Now, we have to remember that only a fraction of the world's refugees end up being resettled in new places. The UNHCR says there's about 65 million refugees and internally displaced persons, so only about a third of them are actually refugees under the international definition, meaning they've crossed an international border because they could not stay in their home countries. The Obama administration refugee policy was to continue the U.S. being a top donor of humanitarian assistance around the world. We had support on the Hill from both sides of the aisle on that. Importantly, Senator Lindsey Graham played a key role in continuing in the Foreign Operations Appropriations Subcommittee, and Kay Granger on the House side to fund the office that I was privileged to lead, the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. There was a great deal, of course, diplomatic efforts to try to bring peace and resolve conflicts, and yet the scorecard on that did not show a lot of wins. One of the things Antonio Guterres, who for 10.5 years was the High Commissioner for Refugees and is now the UN Secretary General, one of the things he noted was that when he began his tenure as High Commissioner, there were the prospects of resolving conflicts and returning refugees to their homes, and that hasn't happened lately. Instead, we see conflicts dragging on, becoming prolonged, becoming very messy, and people staying refugees for far too long, children growing up as refugees, so that if we say, oh, well, we'll get them to school once things calm down, they never get to school. Their whole childhoods are spent without education. And then there's resettlement, which is considered a so-called durable solution for refugees. The U.S. was a leader. And this whole program, though, had cratered after 9/11. And so both the George W. Bush administration and the Obama administration had spent years building back up the numbers to, not to the heights in the past. In the Vietnam era, there was a high point of bringing 200,000 refugees to the U.S., but building them up so that when I was coming into my job, we were able to bring 70,000, 5 years ago, 70,000 refugees in for 3 years straight. And it was time, I felt, and others felt, to increase that number. And what surprised me was that the White House wanted to really boost that number, not just sort of a stair-step approach, but to raise it to 85,000, to bring more Syrians. We're very much criticized for not bringing enough Syrians. And then also this year to reach 110,000, a number that clearly will not be reached this year. There was attention from the media on refugees fleeing Afghanistan and Iraq, in part because so many foreign correspondents had served overseas and seen some of the people they trusted and who helped them and who protected them on the battlefield, translators, drivers, interpreters, trusted colleagues, threatened and needing to flee, even after there was a sense that new governments were in place in those countries. So for me, September 2015 was a key moment because poor Aylan Kurdi's body, a Syrian toddler's body, washed up on the shore in Turkey, and the picture of that iconic photo of his body went viral around the world. And there was suddenly the world woke up to something that we knew about, which was this massive migrations taking place around the world, and particularly from the Middle East to Europe. Then the other date that I have burned into my memory is November 13th, 2015, because that evening in Paris, the attacks were launched by primarily European-born jihadis, but including some people who either were refugees or had been disguised as refugees. Somebody left material suggesting that he'd been a refugee. And there was this instantaneous conclusion that refugees were on the march and therefore a threat, that the people walking to Europe, many of whom were young and able-bodied and interested in getting opportunities either for education or for jobs, must have been hiding terrorists among their midst. And so that week between November, I think it was 16, and Thanksgiving break, when Congress left town, I was called up the Hill 6 times to explain, how are these people getting in here? Why are they coming? What do you do to ensure that they're not terrorists? What is your vetting process? And I think we were not quite ready to explain that in common English to the press or to the Hill, because Republican questioners, including some who were running for president at the time, were very antagonistic. And Democrats on the House side were very pro-refugee, but on the Senate side, they were more guarded. Perhaps because when you're a member of Congress, you're representing districts that can be overwhelmingly immigrant, overwhelmingly foreign-born, but on the Senate, you have a much broader group of people you represent. The President Obama chose to show leadership by putting together the Refugee Summit of September 20th last year, where countries had to earn an invitation, they had to make commitments to either, for wealthy countries, it was to give more money for humanitarian assistance and to accept more refugees, either through resettlement programs or through other pathways like scholarships, humanitarian visas, and parole. And for countries that hosted a lot of refugees, they had to agree that they would either get more kids in school or allow refugees to work. That long list of commitments now exists. The UN has it on its website, but who will ensure that those commitments are backed up? That's a prevailing question. If the US is not going to do that, who will? And I believe there'll be a follow-up conference that perhaps the Dutch will lead in September. The political campaigns, you can see some of the strands of what became the executive order in the dialogue, but there was no package or plan. I know this shocks you. There was no plan coming out of the Republican Party on what to do with the refugees. Instead, there was a lot of rhetoric about no Syrians, no Muslims, no people from war zones, which is a problem because the definition of refugees is they're fleeing persecution and war. And then talk about needing extreme vetting. It wasn't clear when people called for extreme vetting if they were aware of what vetting already takes place, which is pretty thorough and intensive and has become more thorough since 2011, when this was carried out by Obama administration national security staff, really pulling together different agencies, not just state and Department of Homeland Security, state having oversight for the whole program, DHS being the decision makers about who enters the country or not, but also other law enforcement, national security, intelligence. So that brings us up to the transition, where pretty much nothing happened on these issues, as you know. The new president, the president-elect, was slow to have transition folks appear and work within and show up in the agencies. And so the executive order was released when the nominee for Secretary of State was not yet confirmed. There was little to no consultation with the affected agencies. It was signed at the Defense Department, and you see in where we are today with tremendous pushback against this. I'm surprised and in some ways both horrified by the executive order, but thrilled by the outpouring of public support for immigrants and refugees, which we had not seen, say, in November 2015. Over to you.
Well, before I became a law professor, I was a prosecutor, and I was very nasty and tough, and put lots of people in jail for bank robbery and fraud and all sorts of maledictions. But I was careful. And I was, if anything, I would subpoena everything except the kitchen sink and make sure I was right, and took the burden of proof, and proof beyond a reasonable doubt is a very serious vocation, and also believed, I suppose, in natural justice, that you really ought to have that little id inside you that tells you something's wrong, that you don't proceed on a purely positivistic basis. You make sure that you feel comfortable morally, lest you go to hell with what you're doing. And therefore, I guess more than I'm not a terribly excitable person, but this has really pissed me off. Because I, again, think of federal employment as a privilege, and which I no longer have, and a vocation and a moral responsibility. So I am inclined to take a less charitable view of how this all happened. I think that it's at least plausible to suppose that the new president has a media advisor, whose name might or might not be Bannon, who has a sense of dramaturgy and might think this was a really kick-ass way to start a new presidency. It's not, because of what you saw at, or read about, in very close quarters at Dulles Airport, where it's just horrible to watch. Little kids have no place to sleep, there's nothing to eat, there are no chairs, where there's a panic, there's an existential panic, particularly if you think that you might be sent back to a place which you now have made dangerous if it wasn't dangerous to start with. So I see this as a just profound moral breach. Yes, I believe in natural law, but it's a breach of every characterization of the law of nations. Whether it's Pufendorf or Vattel or even a positivist like Jeremy Bentham would say this was bad morals. So the other cautionary point is, I think once people get a whiff of what they can get away with, they're tempted to continue to do it because it's fun, it's a game, it's a gambit. You're the big kid on the block. So if this kind of behavior of really simply mocking, torture is too strong a word, but taunting, deliberately making uncomfortable people who are in the most raw state of uncertainty. This catches on, and if it worked before politically, it'll work again. So between the newly incumbent president and Mr. Bannon, I worry that this might be taken as a kind of a plan for the future. We know from the sad history of World War II that things don't always go well for refugees who've been turned away. So the St. Louis, which was not allowed to dock at the US, Franklin Roosevelt was not perfect on this point, shall we say. They did not end well. They went back to Europe. Many of them were killed in concentration camps. So the idea that if we don't do it, somebody else will, no, the US's own conceit about being the indispensable nation is true. And that is a responsibility, not a way to evade the right thing to do. Again, this is not a matter of partisanship or nonpartisanship, but we had quite an extraordinary group of people from the last administration. Avril Haines, who was a good friend of mine, Madeleine Albright, Carrie McLaughlin, Lisa Monaco, Janet Napolitano, all of whom said that the executive order that now forced the exclusion of these people was ill-conceived, poorly implemented, ill-explained. And I would say, add to their list, inhumane. Because the vetting that needed to take place could have taken place in country, or people could have been put on a wait list to have the vetting take place before they were embarked, instead of leaving them in hard back chairs in the airport. There is a lawsuit, which is of some interest, filed in the state of Washington, and it happens to have drawn a fairly thoughtful judge who is going to look, I think, I would suppose, into the bona fides of the claim that there was no alternative to this. If he really is putting people in a position where they're suffering harm, then an inquiring mind might want to know whether that harm was avoidable, whether it was, how shall we say, anticipated and seen as a virtue, not a vice. So there have been oral arguments in front of a judge in Seattle, and I predict that the administration will not be especially happy with the way that this decision comes out. Because federal judges, even though they send people to jail and occasionally sentence people to death, are generally rather balanced folks who care about facts, who care about equity, who care about law. And this was all done in a slipshod way. So quite apart from what you think about the kind of meta questions of which country should take on more people, why is Europe so generally grudging about trans-Mediterranean escapes, why have we often been grudging in our quotas? This is simply raucous World Wrestling Federation punch them in the nose, bloody them up, show who's boss kind of dramaturgy. And I bet you Steve Bannon thought of it all and sold it to his client. So in that sense, I hope that, myself, that the judge in Seattle takes a reticent, sober, well-explained, well-grounded view in how this case should be handled. But I will bet you 100 to 1 that the legitimacy of the flat ban will be overturned. And I do think that it's an argument. I think Refugees International has to stay apolitical and a little farther away from partisan issues. But I do think that American human rights groups and American academics and other Americans should take a very tooth and fang interest in this and not treat this as simply another curiosity of the malfunction of government, but as something that's directly insulting to all of us to stand by and be asked to watch. And I would predict, indeed, that one or more federal judges will strike this down, and that it might stand as a lesson to the Trump administration, which has many bright people in it, that this is not the way to conduct business, not the way to make a historical reputation, historical legacy, but rather it's a big black eye for first at bat.
Thank you. I thank you all for your remarks. I'm going to turn it over to the audience very shortly. But I have a couple of questions for the panel first. One of the things that has troubled me, one of many things that has troubled me, is the idea that there had to be a 90-day ban on refugees from certain countries and a 120-day ban on refugees on the basis of the need to examine the effectiveness of the current vetting system. To my understanding of it, we already have extreme vetting. There are 8 U.S. government agencies involved, federal government agency involved, 6 different security databases, 5 separate background checks, 4 biometric security checks, 3 separate in-person interviews, 2 interagency security checks. So can anybody on this panel think of anything that isn't being done, that could be done to more thoroughly vet these? And this process takes usually up to 2 years. So is there anything that we're missing? Is there anything additional that can be done?
Well, one of the problems was, you're dealing with human beings. And so we were asked, can you guarantee no one will ever slip through who could be a threat to the United States? And, there's 3.3 million people who've come through this program since the Vietnam era. So in any group of 3.3 million humans, there will be a few difficult characters, undoubtedly. And the Bowling Green case, which was not a massacre, did fuel this concern that the people making these decisions were letting through people who, terrorists who wanted to attack Americans. Now, the 2 Iraqis who came in, one of them was found to have a fingerprint on a device that was part of an IED back in Iraq. And so they are now both in jail, and they did not carry out, contrary to what some people think, they did not carry out their plans and overseas or here. But that's our nightmare, is that they're, you can say you're doing extreme vetting, but if one person starts carrying out bad acts, they can be tremendously lethal. What I tried to convince congressmen of, and pretty much failed, I would say, is that what we need to do is focus on radicalization especially of impressionable youth of all stripes, whether they're influenced by ISIS or white nationalists or, it's what can communities do to protect themselves from the radicalized and tremendously lethal young man who wants to shoot up schools and wants to attack innocent people. And that would be the most productive, in my view, way to go forward. But that was not my job, was to understand the psychology of what sets these guys off.
If I could just add, I think the best way to seduce youth to virtue is to give them some hope of doing something else. So indeed, if you have countries where we could be effective in targeted economic aid and industrial projects, in getting commerce going, that is going to be the best kind of bringing them back to Jesus, so to say.
But even then, you can't guarantee 100%.
Absolutely not.
Yeah, and so one of my heroes is Governor Jay Inslee of Washington State, because the Monday after the Paris attacks, he was asked on NPR, don't you think there's a risk? And he said, you take a risk getting out of bed every morning. And I thought that shows perspective.
I think it's interesting that more people have been killed by domestic terrorists, white nationalists, anti-black terrorists, than by ISIS-related terrorists or al-Qaeda-related terrorists in this country. And there was a gentleman, Mr. Naraste from the Cato Institute, who had done some analysis of the statistics on refugees, and that's a conservative think tank. And he said the chances between 1975 and 2016, the chances of an American being killed by a refugee were 1 in 3.64 billion. So, I mean, the odds suggest that you are more likely to be, if there's terrorist attacks that takes place, it's more likely to be a domestic terrorist than a foreign terrorist, certainly not a refugee terrorist. And it seems, you will wonder why we get so much more exercised about someone who says, praise Allah before he does a mass murder, than somebody who just mass murders for ordinary, crazy reasons.
Maureen, I would add that the rhetoric right now has not talked about Muslims killed in the US by Americans, and that has happened, and the current rhetoric
Canada last
would likely increase that risk,
Yes.
and that, I think, is extremely irresponsible.
Yeah.
What does surprise me is that since the inevitable lawsuit was filed, and it's before a very thoughtful judge in Seattle, who does take the rule of law seriously, if I was Mr. Trump's political advisor, legal advisor, I'd say, be sure you want to go down this road before you embark. And if you know you're going to lose a lawsuit or 90 to 10, don't do it in the first place. Don't try to push something as indefensible. So I'm quite, he needs a different bookie to tell him what horse to bet on. And this was not the right, and since this was going to happen at a variety of different airports, and therefore a variety of different judicial districts, sure shooting one of them was going to come out badly, and have an angry judge who didn't like having this paraded in front of him, who would castigate the government and therefore implicitly castigate Mr. Trump. So I think it was whoever advised him to do this, it was not a smart move politically, quite apart from our reputation in the world at large.
Another question for you, Ruth, is that the president, though, the executive branch does have a lot of leeway on making laws with regard to immigration. So this may be a particularly bad law, but if it does come to as this issue winds its way through the courts, it's now before the District Appeals Court in San Francisco. And they are hearing at 6 o'clock this evening briefs from the Justice Department and from the Justice Department and the Attorney Generals of Washington and Minnesota, who are at odds over this issue. So, and it may eventually end up in the Supreme Court. But the question is, the president does have a lot of leeway to make these decisions regarding immigration, and to second guess his authority in this region, in this area. I mean, it's for all the reasons we have said, it is bad, but he is legitimate to act in this arena, correct?
He doesn't have summary authority to take prisoners in the White House. He can't pick a guy up on the street and put him in the basement. there is still an idea of due process or of minimal due process and procedure that has to be followed to show that a claim is factually grounded. Otherwise, I could arrest Vali Nasser because I'm annoyed at the coffee he serves. So the idea that not only does the law have to be there with a appropriately selected court, and the judge in Seattle went through quite a careful analysis of why he had jurisdiction, but it has to be factually grounded. And I guess, I mean, I was bombed by the FALN when I was 33 years old, working in the Southern District. I survived it. People do get bombed. It's a hazard of life. But I guess what I really objected to is it seemed to me, whether it was inadvertent or advertent, that the crowd scenes at the variety of airports almost were becoming like a sideshow, a deliberate attempt at humiliation. Because anybody who was a good hostess or host would have thought to have adequate bathrooms and sleeping cots and foodstuffs and liquids. And it may have all, again, just been very, very bad logistics. But if so, they should have stopped to think how this would look to the rest of the world. It would look like Macedonians, Libyans crowded behind a barbed wire fence with not enough to eat and trying to push down the fence. It would look like cruelty was being inflicted. And inadvertent though it may have been, I think cruelty was inflicted.
I think in terms of the refugees who were headed to the United States and suddenly stopped, that was tremendously cruel. These are people who, by definition, have already been traumatized. And now, you know, the tap of coming and going, it kind of gets turned on, turned off. There's a great deal of uncertainty. And so I think that is also cruel. What I do know is that the president has the right to bring in less than 110,000 refugees. So cutting the number to 50,000 is certainly within his rights. And also, probably pausing it is within his rights, although it's a terrible way to manage a program. What I think is got to be a problem for the equitable treatment of people under our immigration and refugee laws is this idea of picking 7 countries. Does that present a particular dilemma that, you know, just on the basis of your nationality, you were going to be screened out from a legal standpoint? Does that make a difference?
The president has lots of discretion in decisions on foreign affairs, but if the claim was that these particular countries, because of factual findings, were unusual hotheads of terrorism, then I suppose you could certainly rev up the degree of scrutiny that was required to show that somebody was not part of the illicit group. But I think there was a lot of just blunderbuss, wholesale categorization of what people were about, instead of what I take to be the job of law and equity, which is to have careful, individualized, fact-based inquiries so you can tell fish from fowl. And surely in the crowd scene in Dulles Airport, you couldn't do that. It was a fantasy to suppose you could. So my prosecutorial surmise is this was slapped together at the last minute. They had no time to make plans, and it turned out much worse on camera than they ever expected it to be. And may not be repeated in quite this form again for that reason.
Okay, so I'd like to open it to the audience for questions. Right here in the first row.
I thought the whole thing was unconstitutional.
Anything. The questioner is saying she thought that it made it unconstitutional because he specified Muslims. But I think what they did was they set out to bar Muslims and then instead switched to countries, did not come close to barring all the Muslims on earth, thank God. And instead picked 7 countries. And so that's the...
But he did say Muslims could come in and from those countries and could not, and Christians could. So he was specifying.
What's the executive order say? I think it says that it's barring people from those countries.
Can you wait for the mic?
We go back to the birther movement, all the Muslims that were protesting in New Jersey when 9/11 occurred, and all this alternative facts proffered. I think the thing that Hillary really didn't address when she and Obama were accused of starting ISIS, it's really what will be the impact of this. This is exactly what ISIS and Iran and others, they couldn't be happier by what it's so unsophisticated. He doesn't play chess, but where are we if things go down the road? Because I think you're really playing right into the hands of ISIS and our enemy.
Just in direct response to that, the Ayatollah Khomeini has said that, thank God for Donald Trump, he has shown the true face of America, just as we always said. You know, you're absolutely right. Anybody in the security, many people in the Department of Defense, in the security field and think tanks around this country believe it will make America much less safe because we have now been seen as being anti-Muslim in a way that both the Bush administration and the Obama administration tried very, very hard not to make it the West against the Islam. And this has reversed that pattern deliberately and destructively.
I can add a piece too. I think the press has done a good job covering that point, that this is just sort of fueling ISIS's desire to have this a clash of civilizations. There's another wrinkle on this, which was, as the Assistant Secretary in our Bureau, the Population, Refugees, and Migration Bureau, I was going out around the world asking governments to keep borders open, to take in refugees, to treat them well. And then, as I mentioned, the Obama policy was to try to get more kids, refugee kids in school and allow refugees to work. So we had a moral high ground. We would get pushback saying, well, you take so few and we've taken millions. And then we'd say, well, we're going to do our part. You know, we're leaders in the aid. We're leaders in the formal resettlement program, and we take them year in and year out, so it adds up over time, and we take them permanently. So this is undermined then by their be able to come back and say, why should I let refugees into my country? You're not letting them into your country now. And so that undermines our ability to be diplomatic advocates around the world as well.
I should add that the locution that Mr. Trump invented, or Ms. Conway invented, of extreme vetting, I'm not sure what that is. It's not a legal term. It sounds as very sinister to me. I'm going to look in between their teeth and up their nose, in their ears, and make them take off their underwear to see if they're
I'll tell you,
circumcised or
Ruth,
not.
this was rattling around the hill, and it was not
It's a
clear
horrible
when it
phrase.
was used in the campaigns what extreme vetting was. And it has, one school is that refugees should get a test before they come to the U.S. to see if they share our values.
You can quiz them on the Bill of Rights if you want to, but this kind of thing, it sounds like emergency law. Again, I always have Adolf Hitler in my mind, and when you use phrases that have no grounding in law, like
I think
extreme
you're right.
vetting, it's
to
got
zero in on
a
that
fascistic
because
quality to it.
it's testing whether someone believes in motherhood and apple pie, and it's not clear how do you test that, and how do you know that it's actually working? Especially, I mean, does the president share my values right now? I don't think so. So who's going to design? Whose test is it going to be?
I can give you the answer.
Lots of questions. Dan.
Daniel Serwer, I'm a professor here at Johns Hopkins SAIS. Ruth, I think I agree with you entirely that the odds are very bad for this executive order to be sustained in court. But then you have to ask yourself, why would they put themselves at risk this way? What's the reward if they win? And I think the reward if they win is very, very big. And they have a better chance of winning than they do on some domestic issues where the president is more constrained. If they win, they get to institute a system which does not acknowledge equality of individuals before the law. It actually does It does give preference to Christians. If they win, they have a precedent for non-fact-based executive action. That is, you don't have to justify what you're doing by the threat that exists. And the third thing is that they get validation of the idea that the president can do anything he likes for national security purposes. As long as there's a national security risk, he can do what he wants. It also validates President Trump's rather vicious comments about the court system. So I think they're taking a calculated risk here that they believe is worthwhile because it would punch through so many principles that they want to be rid of.
My answer to that is I predict they're going to lose in court. And therefore, that would be a really bad, extremely bad bet to have made.
Well, but it is interesting that you point out that if they do win, they have really, really changed the game dramatically. So let's just pray.
Under any religious belief system.
Praise Allah. Oh, yes, right there.
My question is, I think, for Ruth. So you have the 9 to 10 odds, and those are odds that I can sleep at night comfortably with. But I still don't understand what is the law that odds are based on. Like, what law did the president break by saying no Syrian refugees can come? Is there such a law? And if there is, please tell me exactly what it is so I can sleep comfortably at night as a green card holder from a predominantly Muslim country.
Well, I'm not an immigration lawyer, so for technical questions, I would have to refer you to a very good friend of mine. But
90 to 10 odds is a very good odds, right?
The word extreme is anybody who, law has a certain poetry, just like poetry has poetry. And the word extreme, that's what really makes your hair stand on end. I'm going to do an extreme investigation of your conscience, an extreme look at your armpit. The law does not use the locution extreme itself seems to be lawless. And therefore, it's almost like it's a solipsism. Extreme vetting, careful vetting,
But he can
thorough
say,
vetting. But extreme vetting sounds like an instigation to violence to me.
True, but he can say that no Syrian refugees are
He
going
can
to be
say that,
allowed.
yeah.
Is that correct?
He can say that. He is legally entitled to say that and to try to get it through. The courts are testing whether or not that is in violation of other laws, or we have 127 companies, individual corporate entities, which have signed amicus briefs with these two state attorney generals because they feel that it has a negative impact on their business for these some aspects of the law, of the executive order, have negative impacts on their businesses. So, he can do this, but people can fight in the courts on other grounds that it is destructive or unlawful or negatively impacts other companies or other individuals. So there's a whole range of ways that the courts can look at this and say that it's illegal. Oh dear, let's see, slide it back.
Hello, my name is Stacy Shamber. I want to thank you all for organizing this discussion and gathering today. Like many here, I share your concerns. I have a big picture question, kind of looking forward to the future. What do you envision as the best strategy or approach for U.S. and other European countries to facilitate the integration and welcome of refugees? And part two, given the number of refugees in the world and the protracted nature of a lot of the conflicts, their concentration in Africa and the Middle East that you spoke of, what is the moral obligation or best strategy there to those countries as well? Thank you.
Can you repeat the second part? The first part was what can we do to be more welcoming?
Well,
To integrate.
welcoming,
to
but also in
integrate
terms
them.
of addressing long-term integration of refugees into
Yeah.
the U.S. and European nations who, of course, where people are concerned about security, where there are history of diverse cultures,
Yeah.
et cetera. And then the part two is specifically for countries in Africa and the Middle East where there are developmental and governmental and other security challenges.
I can tell you the state of where this stands right now. In terms of integration, you know, the U.S. has a great story to tell. We've been very successful about bringing in refugees and having them start their lives over. And whether people know it or not, I mean, large numbers of the refugees go on to pay taxes, start businesses, succeed. You know, think of all the kids from Vietnam who ended up being valedictorians, you know, a short time later. And so what we have done is invite Europeans to come to the U.S. and go on the International Visitors Program and visit the folks who work at the grassroots level, at the street level, resettling refugees. Because the resettlement program is run as a public-private partnership, 9 networks across the U.S. Resettle refugees, 6 are faith-based. They work with parishes and churches and synagogues and other groups to collect used furniture, find willing landlords who will house them at a reasonable rate and outfit apartments and help them get Social Security cards and find jobs and get the kids enrolled in school. And year in and year out, it works really, really well. So we have a great story to tell. And I have accompanied Europeans to visit in Silver Spring, where one Dutch leader said, you know, we keep the refugees aside and give them training and language classes, but they're really unhappy. And here, you're doing something complete, which seems cruel, you know, insisting people get jobs in 3 months if they're able-bodied. But what it does is it plunges them right into our society. And so it actually gives them a place and a role and that dignity and agency that most of us want in our lives. So we have a good story to tell. On the second part about, you know, overseas, this is why there's so much of an effort now to not just provide assistance to refugees, but to also help the local communities that are hosting them, especially in places where the local community is not well off to start with and feels a strain from having their hospital beds filled and their school classrooms overflowing with refugee kids.
Yeah, I would add that traditionally the assistance to refugees have been, they get humanitarian aid for as long as they are refugees. And humanitarian aid is very good at saving lives in the first year of a crisis. It's necessary and it's well tested. But over time, it suffers from a reduction of budgets, and it doesn't have any competency to try to help refugees integrate wherever they are. More and more refugees are outside camps. They are distributed among local population. I think there was one good news last year among all our depression with the fact that the budgets are going down, etc., is that the World Bank has finally accepted that they do have a responsibility for refugees, not in the name of poverty, etc., in the name of stability in the countries where they are. And they have even dropped some of their criteria, which was based on GDP. You know, basically, we are here to help poor countries. And now they agree to help countries like Jordan or Turkey or Lebanon precisely on the criteria of stability. It's a World Bank. They move slowly. It's not yet solving problems. But I think that the major...
But they have a lot of resources.
Yes, exactly.
So they're a real powerhouse coming into this landscape of humanitarian response.
And traditionally, we were saying that a situation become protracted after 5 years, and I think that's wrong. After 5 years, all the vices of the dependency on humanitarian aid have been ingrained completely. And I think after 1 year, you have to start treating any situation like a potentially protracted situation. I think in the past 25 years, to my memory, there is one refugee crisis that lasted less than a year. It was the Kosovo crisis. It's the only one where refugees went back home within a year after having left. So the experience that refugees go and stay, you know, they cannot go back, and we've been very bad at solving conflict. I mean, we have refugee population today that were refugees when I started working in the business 30 years ago.
There's a great concern that there can be a kind of a intergenerational dependency, unless you get refugees into a situation like living in Silver Spring, where they can open small businesses and run flower shops and haircut joints and fixing the shattered screen on your iPhone. Unless you can get them fairly quickly into a productive enterprise, their psychology is going to become depressed, and it's a bad example for the encouragement of the admission of other refugees as well.
Okay, another question. I should go way in the back, the very last row there, gentleman back. Yes.
Thank you very much. So with respect to, I don't know, arbitrary number, 10 administrations or so, the way that Congress has reacted to this executive order, is it a regular phenomenon for us to see the way Congress has been reacting, or has Congress done some different things with similar happenings in the past? Just to, yeah.
You know, I think that there are members of Congress on the Republican side who feel very conflicted because it's the start of a new administration. They have the White House and now majority in the, again, in the House and Senate. And so they want to live happily ever after. And that the executive order puts something on the sort of political agenda that some of them are happy about, but not all of them, clearly. And so you see really different voices of, you see, you know, criticism coming from Senator McCain and Senator Graham, who are comfortable, you know.
But also Mitch McConnell.
Acting independently. And then you have others who are quieter, maybe supportive of parts and not other parts. You know, so...
Query to also whether they're waiting for a court case. If there's an adverse finding to the administration on one of these cases coming up quite quickly, it will give a lot of cover for Congress to...
I think we have a core problem that the president is right that he has supporters who are happy with his executive order. And these folks may not be really interested in what they hear on NPR in the morning because they're not listening to NPR in the morning. They're getting their news from a source that mirrors back to them some of their beliefs, which may not be based in facts. And so you know, we can be very self-satisfied that the panel agrees with each other here and that you all are nodding, which is very nice as a speaker to see that. But so what? You know, Donald Trump's going to listen to people who perhaps are misinformed, but they fervently believe he's doing the right thing. So the question from my standpoint is how to reach those people, affect their thinking, get them to plug into this sort of American tradition of being open to refugees and immigrants. I think one potential area where it might make a difference is the fact that so many veterans are disturbed by this executive order, or at least some are, and speaking up about it. That starts to then shift the sort of polarizing camps and makes one stop and think about, well, who's being hurt by this, and you know, why is this person upset about it?
Query also how much the churches have gotten involved yet. But a church which is trying to support a penniless refugee and who's suffering not only from the lack of income, but from constant derision being flung in his or her direction. I think the churches and synagogues could be very
Some
effective
of the members who I was able to work with during my tenure were members where their conservative churches wanted to bring refugees to the United States. And so they'd have conservative churches that were hostile, and they would have conservative churches that wanted to help. And so there was no clear cut for them way to satisfy everybody, and it made them slow down and think about what the right policy could be.
Gentleman right here.
Yeah, simple question. Why do you preach to the choir? Why wasn't there a composition panel member?
Well, I'm here because Maureen asked, and I do whatever she asks. You know, I'm intelligent that way, and you should be too.
That's actually a very good point. We hastily put this together just last Thursday in the interest, and I sort of reached out to my friends who I knew were experts on the issue, and I happened to be like-minded. But you're right, perhaps I should have another panel in which I bring someone from the opposition and hear their point of view. So thank you for pointing that.
I'd like to ask
Okay.
even though I wouldn't say. So
Here's the microphone.
Sorry. Okay. While I completely appreciate how problematic it is to target either people from certain countries or people from certain religious backgrounds, I'm wondering, and since you're all experts in this, I'm wondering if there are any conditions at all when we could, by we I mean a country, could identify members of certain ideological groups or even national groups that are primarily from a certain ideology in order to subject them to, if not extreme vetting, extra vetting. I ask this primarily because democracies are in a very vulnerable place right now. And it's not just the US. I work with polarized groups. I work to try to strengthen democratic societies, and it's a very bleak time for many democracies. So how can we ensure that those who are terrified, scared, and insecure can be reassured that the country is doing what it needs to protect itself? It's one thing for us. Most of us are very liberal and progressive and very welcoming and want to be humane. It's one thing for us to feel safe in our generosity. But a lot of people are not across the world. So I'm just curious, are there any conditions under which you would say it's okay to focus or target on certain groups because they are problematic?
The current refugee vetting is tougher for Syrians, for example. So obviously, the US government has determined that's okay to do that. The big difference, though, I think, between the executive order and the pre-existing way of handling it is before, everything was case by case. So that refugees were considered based on the head of household coming in and presenting the family's story. And it was examined on an individual basis, individual case basis, so family by family. Similarly, visas are given out based on someone coming in for an interview. So this is tremendously intensive, resource intensive, but it's the way we do it. And so what the executive order has done is moved it from this case by case to barring entire nations. I don't know if you want to add anything, Counselor.
And I would add that the vetting process is so serious that if, for example, someone comes suspicious because the name corresponds to other names that have been identified for security, the family gets put down at the bottom of the list again and have to wait a whole year or 2 years to go. The most difficult way to come to the US is as a resettled refugee. Come with a business or as a tourist or whatever other way, much easier. So I think the vetting system is addressing what you are saying. And part of the groups you're mentioning, I'm sure, are within the files of the different agencies that are vetting refugees. You know, I don't think they necessarily put them public, but I think they know them.
I don't know. In the front row here. In the front row here.
Nina Gardner, an adjunct professor here in the ILA department. To go back to sort of what can we do now in terms of winning the PR war, because it is, if you read, and sometimes I do go onto these sites to find out what people are thinking, they really think that these refugees are coming in to impose Sharia law here, that women, you know, all their daughters will have feminine, you know, genital mutilation. I mean, they really are scared. So I'm just wondering, picking up on your mark and sort of maybe working on with churches, is there any group that is actively maybe working with bringing some refugees into some of these, you know, sort of red states and red communities, working with the churches and having them tell their stories, to explain what the vetting process really was, to show these people that they don't mean to impose Sharia law, and just to win the sort of the war of communication that we're clearly losing. So that we can get, I mean, obviously with LGBT rights, something pretty much has, we've made major progress on that. So maybe on refugees we can do something similar. I'm just wondering whether there are any groups that are starting to sort of figure out how to do this communications properly.
I don't know if you know of anybody, but I think we're doing better than we did before, because I said just in the last couple of weeks, opposite editorials, op-eds that really were very rich about the vetting process. There was one by someone who had been a USCIS, a U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services interviewer, and they talked about how extreme, intensive the vetting is. I know Tom Malinowski, my former colleague, was writing about we are helping Christians, I think the mainstream media is a good idea, doing a good job putting a face on who the refugees and the immigrants are, telling their personal stories. I think the problem is it may not penetrate to people who just aren't listening to that. So I don't know, do we need a Will and Grace that is a TV show that somehow illustrates the refugee? Yeah, I don't know.
Good. Okay, let me ask this gentleman.
This is an echo chamber. Half the American population is afraid or feels threatened or feels something is being done to help refugees while they're sinking economically. They feel that way toward minority groups or lower income people who have government programs. They feel that way toward refugees. I don't like the reaction that, oh, we're going to put something in an advertisement or whatever. That message is new to me, it is extreme vetting, which you've described. It needs to be broadcast to the rest of the country. We're kind of taking each other's laundry here. And I think it's a big mistake not to include whatever you want to call them, Trump supporters, blue-collar workers, whatever, in these kinds of forums. They should be held all around the country.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. I would like to mention about the refugee crisis, more immigration problem. I think the Trump supporter or opposite people create more strong feeling because last administration kind of failed some foreign policy issue. For example, in Turkey, right now holding largest refugees in the world, it's about 3 million people. And most attacks in Europe or several attacks in Turkey coming by these refugee issues with the several groups, either ISIS or PKK, PYD, etc. Is there any way that previous administration can share the self-assessments with the current administration to understand maybe more focus refugee issues in the country that where they are coming from? And I think that will be helpful also make stop increasing the any religions phobia, especially Islamophobia. Is there any way previous administration willing to do this assessments to the new administration and create opposite people or polarization in United States to better understand it is not issue really immigration, it is issue for some foreign policy about the refugee crisis?
Well, there was a lot done in terms of producing transition materials to hand over to the new administration. And there was some joint meetings around the White House just at the very beginning. But I would say that people in the previous administration, like myself, would not have much influence with the current administration. More importantly, I think, is the fact that the United States has career services, the civil service, and in the State Department, the Foreign Service, who stay from administration to administration. So they're the ones who have to brief up and discuss the implications of different policies to the new folks coming in. Now, because fewer people have come in, they're a little behind in terms of nominating people and now getting them confirmed. So that's slowing down the pace of this conversation that is a normal part of the start of every administration from taking place.
But if I catch perhaps the intention of your question, I do think it's a challenge for the refugee assistance community to think of ways that people can stay economically viable and not become dependent like the Palestinians, generation after generation in a camp, which of course radicalizes the young men because there's nothing else to do besides play being mujahideen. So if there could be some way that the atomizing of businesses, small stand-up businesses, whether that's made easier by virtue of computer connections or thinking through ways of taking products to market, that would be enormously important to salvaging lives that otherwise do become codependent. If you're depressed and languorous and for 10 years, you're lost really as an active participant.
And I think I'll take one last question. Oh dear.
Gentleman down there.
In the back, there's a couple questions.
Gentleman down in the back. Oh, yes, that gentleman right there.
Oh, sorry. Hi, thank you. I am Tony Quick, and I promise you no one of consequence. So it's one of those rare queer facts of history that the ships that carried a lot of slaves over on the Middle Passage were also used to bring Irish immigrants over during the Great Migration. And on a similar but seemingly tangential note, I've recently read that a lot of the arguments that Republicans used against DACA and some of Obama's executive actions have also served as a template for how to approach the Trump administration's potential overreach on some of these issues. So my question is twofold here. The first is, how can we begin to divorce racialization from our feelings about immigration and refugees so that regardless of how generous or miserly any administration might be, we can be ensured that our institutions at least are committed to that, to fairness, regardless of nationality or the races that are, majority or minorities there. And on the second note, how can we make sure that the actions that we take now don't hamstring a future administration that might want to be more generous in their approach to immigration and helping refugees? Thank you.
Thank you. Who wants to answer that?
Well, you may want to take the legal aspects of that, but I think what makes it a great question is that we see generations and generations of people coming as refugees and immigrants and initially being discriminated against and then joining the sort of mainstream and being counted in as legitimate Americans, and then they turn around, we all turn around and discriminate against the next wave coming in. But what you've put your finger on in pointing out race, which is persecution based on race is one of the 5 things that qualifies someone to be considered a refugee. Race is something that doesn't go away in the course of your lifetime, unless you're Michael Jackson, I suppose. But is such a something that if someone wants to discriminate against you because of that, you're going to have it's as plain as the freckles on your face in my case. So this is also part of the American story, is the resistance, I think, to becoming a purely colorblind society. And I thought we were making headway a bit with President Obama, and now I'm not so sure. Where this all stands and how this all fits. The protests and the marches around the shootings of young, or not so young, innocent black people that really galvanized people on the racial issue now have been pushed to the side, and we're looking at a lot of marches based on the executive order and on the women's issue. So somehow these threads historians will look back and explain how this all fit together, but I personally don't quite capture it right now.
If I could just say, I think in many ways we've done a much better job than some other countries. As you know, in Turkey, in Germany, the Turks, say who live in Berlin or elsewhere, cannot become Germans. It's still jus solis, where you were born. Excuse me, jus sanguinis, of what ethnicity you are, not jus solis, what territory you're born on. So you can have a fourth, fifth generation Turkish German, and he's not a German citizen. So that we've avoided. It's in this wonderful, panoply of origins that we have, having been so accepting of immigration early on. How you actually get people fully integrated into a society is much trickier. I had a lovely student who was Bill Zartman's 5, 6 years ago. She was a French of Algerian origin. The French would not accept her in any university because she was not really Français. She was la mère proche. So their societies really have quite radical differences in their invitation or tolerance of real vocational family integration. But I guess what bothers me about the late unpleasantness, as I will call it, continuing and late unpleasantness, not the Civil War, but this one, is just so unnecessary. And where things were going pretty good, thank you very much. We have unemployment. What to do about Mexico, besides the wall, is an issue. But nonetheless, I think in terms of tolerance and heterogeneity, it's so different than when I was a kid. I have a friend of every possible persuasion of an ethnicity. And in that sense, really the second, third, fourth generations have a Gemütlichkeit, have a friendship and a warmth that you wouldn't have seen 30 years ago. So that's why this
that ignores what this speaker has pointed out, that a lot of commentators on the election have pointed out, that there is this core group of middle Americans who feel dispossessed, that they're losing in our current society, even as economic indicators show improvement, that they personally don't see it or experience.
And that may be an argument against TPP, but it's not, I don't think it really maps onto race or ethnicity or origin in any obvious way.
I think it's like,
Talking about understanding.
I think it's like 38% have met a Syrian.
That seems high to me, because I think only 1% of Americans are Muslim, right? So it depends if you're in Minnesota or not.
Or maybe 38% may actually know a Muslim.
Mm-hmm. Oh, mm-hmm.
No, that may be too high.
Maureen.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ruth and Michelle.